Hi, I'm Michael Lester on Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7 and 90.3 FM, and streaming live on rnb.org.au. This is Weekly Volunteer Voices, and today I'm going to be talking with Isobel McGarity, who's a volunteer pro bono, a lawyer, working with the organisation RACS, the Refugee Advice and Casework Service. Welcome to Radio Northern Beaches, Isobel.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Isobel, for openers for our listeners, what's the sort of the main mission that you undertake with RACS? You provide legal advice and assistance for free, do you, basically?
That's right, yeah. RACS is the only organisation in New South Wales that provides dedicated legal support, so that's both advice and ongoing representation to refugees and people seeking asylum.
Right. And what's the scale of the operation, if I could ask, just roughly? Is it a very big organisation in terms of the number of people that are contributing and volunteering their time like you?
As far as full-time staff members, we're around 15, but our volunteer numbers are huge, actually, and we rely a lot on volunteers. And we have volunteers from a number of different walks of life. So we have a lot of legal students, which is how I started my time at RACS back in 2013. We also have other students from universities, people who volunteer at our events, people who attend our events. We have other pro bono lawyers from firms, and then individual lawyers who give up their time. So we're very lucky in that we get a lot more done thanks to a small army of volunteers.
Oh, well, that's terrific to hear. You must face a very large demand for your services. I think you said you're the only free volunteer service. Are there government services available that provide the same sort of advice and assistance that you do for refugees?
Not the same sort of assistance that we provide, no. So RACS used to be funded by the government, and then when that changed in 2013, we lost our government funding. So since then we've been relying primarily on donations from everyday people who care about the rights of people seeking asylum. And yeah, since that time we've really had to ramp up our profile and get to know the community and let the community know that we're here to support people seeking asylum. And as far as numbers of our clients, we would see thousands of people a year. Wow. That might be for a telephone advice appointment. It might be that somebody accesses one of our drop-in services, so we're physically present usually in Westmead and Parramatta and Auburn. It might be that somebody comes to us and we realise that they need full representation, so that's something we can do as well. Right,
so government funding was available previously, I take it, at the federal government level. There's no, but was cut back, and you have no government funding at all for what you do, and there's no state government assistance or funding for you either, or?
Not for the main work that we do, no. So we are primarily run on grants, on, as I said, philanthropy from the community. Yeah, that's right. So it's definitely been a big change in the way that we've worked over the time. I think when I started at RACS, it was a couple of weeks after the election and the announcement of the cuts had been made, and I was, just, I think, 21-year-old at uni and didn't really understand how significant that was. But yeah, it's to the organisation's credit and to everyone who supported us, to their credit, that we're still here today.
So you volunteer as a lawyer and you started as a student, so you've obviously been doing this work for some time, I guess, and have some experience of it. The pro bono, that means for our listeners, of course, obviously, that you're lawyers who do it for the public good, as it were, and that therefore it is totally voluntary. But that's often associated with the law firms you work with. Is that the case with you? Or?
So I'm a staff member, which means that... Right. Yes, but when I said pro bono before, we do work with a number of firms, and they give us their time for free. Right. So when I started at RACS, I was a volunteer for about 8 months, and that was not obviously a member of staff. It was during my final year of university, and then I continued on as a volunteer for a couple of months after that. And then eventually joined staff in administration, and then left for about a year, and then came back to RACS as a lawyer in 2015. So, while I was working at another organisation for that 1 year, I actually came and volunteered with RACS as well at that time. So, I've had a kind of a long relationship with the organisation through both volunteering but also now as a staff member.
Oh, it's great to see such effective, widespread volunteering networks, as it were, working with each other and whatever. In terms of the sort of legal work that you get involved in, it must be a very complicated and technical area, because it's quite daunting, at least to someone like myself, to even take a quick look at the legal issues that you might be confronting on behalf of your clients. There's, for example, many different sorts of visas, aren't there, that we're talking about? Temporary protection visas, permanent protection visas, safe haven enterprise visas. Can you take us briefly through a couple of those and indicate what sort of issues they throw up for you and the clients you're working with?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think you put that very well then, actually. The Migration Act itself is a very complex piece of legislation, and that's what we're working with. The differences between some of those visas that you just mentioned, and I'll just say that they are all refugee visas in the sense that for somebody to qualify for one, they have to satisfy the definition of refugee in Australian law. But, for example, the law discriminates depending on your mode of arrival in Australia. So if you came by boat without a visa, then the only types of visas you're able to apply for are, as you said, the temporary protection visa or the safe haven enterprise visa, or a SHEV. If you came by plane on another visa, then you might, and you cannot return to your home country because you fear serious harm, then you might apply for a protection visa, which is a pathway to permanent residency, whereas the other two for people who arrive by boat are not. So in any of these visas, you have to satisfy a strict legal test, and that is that you face serious or significant harm in your home country. And so obviously at RACS, to assist people through this process, not only do we need to understand the way the migration law operates, we also need to very closely look at countries from which people come, keep an eye on the news, current affairs, what's happening in those countries. It's a very broad-reaching area of law, but it's also very personal, which I think is why I was certainly drawn to it, and many of our volunteers say that they're very happy to assist. It's that person-to-person contact.
Well, yes, person-to-person contact. That must be both rewarding and challenging, and I guess particularly at this stage with the coronavirus in place, you would typically operate, I take it, on these varied cases with your clients face-to-face, as you say. How do you now, have you had to change your operations in any respect with the coronavirus situation?
Yeah, absolutely. It has changed. The work hasn't disappeared or lessened at all, but the way that we operate has definitely had to change. I mentioned before that we often have outreach clinics where basically anyone can show up seeking advice on this area of law. Sometimes we get 60, 70, 80 people coming along to one of those clinics. They've all had to stop. We're all practicing social distancing. We're all working from home at the moment, which means that all of our work has pivoted to being by telephone. Obviously, that has its challenges, particularly when you're working with clients whose first language isn't English. It's amazing how much you can communicate face-to-face based on body language or, mime and looking through documents. So without that, it's definitely posed a challenge. And it's meant that our costs as far as interpreters have certainly risen. But we're still trying to give those services to people. We've got lawyers now manning the phone, so ordinarily our volunteers would be on the front line answering our phones. Because of coronavirus, we've actually had to shut down our office, which means that our volunteers aren't able to help us. So we're manning the phone, so basically anyone who calls in can get legal advice, but it has been very challenging, and without that volunteer power it's been very difficult because they help us so much in our day-to-day operations and they're such a big part of our organisation, so it's been a real change.
So I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understood. Why have your volunteers who would normally man the phones are no longer able to participate, but they're replaced by volunteer lawyers, as it were? I'm not sure I understood that.
Yeah, sure. So ordinarily we would have, 10, sometimes more volunteers in our office.
Yes.
And also a number of volunteers at our outreach services. So they would often be the first port of contact for our clients, often legal students. But because we've had to shut our office down, and each staff member, and when I say staff member, I mean a bunch of primarily lawyers, some support staff, we're all at home, but it's not always appropriate to have our volunteers working from home just because it's very difficult with some of the work we do, it can be very sensitive, it can be difficult. We really want to have everyone together and have that supportive environment. So at the moment, without being able to be all together, our volunteers are waiting until we can reopen our office and then join us again.
Right, I see. Yeah, no, that makes sense. So you mentioned interpretation. You would draw on a large pool of interpreters, and are those normally mostly volunteers too, or what's the story?
So in the past, we've certainly had a lot of volunteer interpreters. There was a policy announced in 2017 where a huge number of people were expected to put in applications in a very short amount of time. And I think the project that RACS developed to try and meet that need brought together a lot of volunteers, both lawyers from other firms, also interpreters, and they all worked together to try and make sure that people could get their applications in before the deadline. Since that time, it's very difficult with people giving up their time as interpreters because often, someone will dial in and it's in that moment that we need to get an interpreter. Certainly if some people are available, it's such a big help and such a big cost saver for us. But yeah, at the moment, again, working from home poses so many challenges, and it's been really one of the hardest things is not having our volunteers there as usual.
Now, in terms of your own experience handling individual cases on behalf of individual clients, that must involve a very potentially close and personal relationship. How would you characterise those sorts of experiences that you're going through as a volunteer lawyer, a pro bono lawyer, or your lawyers sort of dealing with these cases?
Yeah, look, I think I said before, it's such a human area of law, and to say that you're not affected, I think would be wrong. So it's definitely a matter of walking that line of, knowing that you're helping as much as you can, and that's definitely something positive. I guess as a lawyer you kind of try and use the law to the best advantage of your client, but sometimes cases are really difficult to work on, and so it's a matter of making sure you've got personal strategies to deal with that. With our volunteers, we have a lot of debrief options, so we'll do particular training with them so that if they do have a very difficult call or they meet someone in distress, they know how to respond. That's something RACS is very proud of, actually. But it doesn't get easier over time. It's just one of those areas that, where it's always a bit difficult, but at least, especially as a volunteer, you know that you're playing a small part in helping that person.
And do you work with an individual client over a long period of time? What's sort of the duration of these cases and contacts with an individual client?
It can really vary, actually. Sometimes a person might just call us for a one-off advice on a particular issue, and then I've had clients who I've been working with for a number of years. So the matters can go on for very long. We've got some fairly long wait times for processing cases, both at the tribunals, in the courts, at the department level. So sometimes you'll be working with the same person for a number of years.
Yes, we do hear about some people who get caught in the system and whose cases seem to be protracted, almost like a limbo state for many, many years. Is that a common feature, or is that unusual and exceptional?
I would say that's a common feature of the way that law and policy has played out over the last few years, particularly for a large cohort of people who arrived by boat between 2012 and 2013. They were left, as you say, in legal limbo for a number of years because they weren't allowed to apply for protection. And I mentioned that project before, in which they were suddenly given a deadline by which to put in their applications. So I think that's an example where people have been left to wait for a very long time and then given a very short amount of time to put in an application, which I should mention is no easy task. It's a very long form, lots of questions, and also to accompany that form you should write a statement, what we call a statement of claims. So they're the reasons that you left your home country and the reasons that you can't return there.
So you're not only involved also in this incredible amount of paperwork, I'd imagine it must be incredible, but lots of processes. Does that even involve appearing before tribunals and in courts?
Yeah, that's right. So RACS will represent clients before the Department of Home Affairs. So in order to determine whether somebody's a refugee, they need to be interviewed, have a chance to express orally their claims for protection. RACS also assists people at the tribunal, the AAT. And we also have a referral service where we assist people who are at the court stage, so seeking review of a decision of either a tribunal or a government body.
This is an incredible amount of very complicated and specialised work that you and your colleagues at RACS are undertaking on behalf of many thousands of refugees and asylum seekers in Australia. It's an amazing thing to hear about the considerable work and energy and time that you put into this, all on a totally voluntary, in a sense that it's not paid for by a government at all. You're doing this independently funded from donations and volunteer work. It's an amazingly wonderful story that you must be very proud of. Just as we wrap up this discussion, Isobel, of course the coronavirus, I think I've read that the people in detention, and we're talking many thousands of people, seem to be a very high-risk group potentially, at-risk group. Is this anything that RACS is in any way involved in? You do advocacy work as well too, don't you? Hello? Hello?
And we've been working.
I'm sorry, for some reason there, for a couple of seconds, that just dropped out as I asked my question about advocacy work. So, yes, do you do advocacy on that issue? Or?
Yes, absolutely. So we've been working with the sector to advocate for the rights of people in detention. As you say, it's a very scary time for all of Australia, and I can recognise how difficult it is for everybody. And I think vulnerable groups, for example, people who are in legal limbo because of their visa, or people who are in detention, are particularly at risk. So RACS has been working to take calls from people in detention, and we've been receiving a lot of calls from people who are distressed and worried about the virus. And so we're working to try and get a solution for those people.
Yeah, that must be particularly difficult because, as I understand it, much of the detention services these days in Australia, right around the country for many thousands of people, are basically outsourced from government to corporates, aren't they? They must have their own corporate responsibilities and whatever in this particular time for these refugees and detainees.
Yeah, that's an interesting angle to look at it. And certainly they're contracted to the government. So first and foremost, we always call on government to do the right thing by the human rights of people in detention. As I said, it's already such a precarious situation to be in. And I think we've seen in the media over the last week the conditions that people are living in. There's a lot of people, it's almost impossible to isolate. So it's certainly something that we won't stop advocating for.
Well, thank you very much, Isobel McGarity, who's with RACS, the Refugee Advice and Casework Service, a fully independent, donation-funded organisation working on behalf of the many thousands of refugees and asylum seekers in Australia. And congratulations, if I may say, Isobel, on the dedication, commitment and expertise that you and your colleagues bring to this very complicated area of human rights concern. And thank you for joining us on Radio Northern Beaches and Volunteer Voices.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay.